Throughout the 1960s and early 70s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, in conjunction with other terror organizations such as Islamic Jihad, carried out numerous terrorist activities in Israel and abroad. The tit-for-tat military confrontation between the main terror organizations continued unabated for the ensuing decades. These included the hijacking of international civilian planes, the most notorious of which was the hijacking and blowing up of 3 international civilian aircraft at Dawson's Field in Jordan in September 1970. Eventually, after what became known as Black September, the PLO was driven out of Jordan by the Jordanian army. It then set up its headquarters in Lebanon and created a state within a state in the southern part of the country. It was from here that the first Katyusha rockets were fired into Kiryat Shmone in northern Israel in 1968. The pinnacle of the terror campaign in the late 1960s and early 70s was reached at the 1972 Munich Olympic Games, when Palestinian terrorists took over part of the Olympic Village, holding and then murdering 11 Israeli athletes. The irony that 11 Israeli athletes were murdered on German soil after several security lapses was not lost on a shocked world and a numbed Israeli society. Prime Minister Golda Meir ordered the Israeli Mossad to track down the killers and assassinate them. It's important to bear in mind that the terror campaign against Israel was conducted from the occupied territories as well as PLO headquarters in Lebanon and Gaza. When the Oslo peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians collapsed in 1995, the Second Intifada broke out, and a vicious terror campaign was unleashed on the Israeli civilian population in the form of a bombing campaign, which included the use of suicide bombers. Buses and restaurants were the favored targets. Between 2001 and 2005, there were 136 terror attacks, including suicide bombers, causing 599 deaths and 766 wounded. The casualties suffered horrendous wounds. The worst of the incidents was the bombing in Netanya of the Park Hotel at the Passover Seder meal in March 2002. Israel retaliated by unleashing Operation Defensive Shield, and the IDF operated throughout the West Bank and Gaza. But it was not until Prime Minister Ariel Sharon took a unilateral decision to remove the total Israeli presence, military and civil, from the whole of the Gaza Strip, that the critical issues, both political and humanitarian, would leap to the forefront of urgent and ongoing crises in Gaza. The Israeli disengagement from Gaza, the Hebrew term was Tochnit Hitnakrut, was the unilateral dismantling in 2005 of the 21 Israeli settlements and the evacuation of all Israeli settlers and army personnel from inside the Gaza Strip. The law, which was passed in the Knesset in August 2004, was called the Disengagement Plan Implementation Law. It was implemented in August 2005 and completed in September 2005. The settlers who refused to accept government compensation packages and voluntarily vacate their homes prior to the 15th of August 2005 deadline were evicted by Israeli security forces over a period of several days. Following the withdrawal, Israel continued to maintain direct control over Gaza's air and maritime space, and all of Gaza's land crossings. It maintained a no-go buffer zone within the territory as well. To this very day, Gaza remains dependent on Israel for its water, electricity, telecommunications, and all other utilities. In other words, Gazans' complete day-to-day way of life. Arik Sharon had originally dubbed his unilateral disengagement plan the separation plan, or Tochnit HaAfrada, before realizing that separation sounded bad, particularly in English because it evoked apartheid. In order to understand the terror campaigns and the resulting wars, it is crucial to have an overview of the timeline of the crises between Hamas, based in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority based in Ramallah, and Israel. 1987. Hamas is created at the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, following a traffic accident involving an Israeli lorry driver. 1993. The first Oslo Accord is signed. Hamas vows to derail the peace process. 2000, July. Israel and the Palestinians failed to reach a final agreement in the peace process at a summit in the United States. 2000, September. The second Palestinian Intifada, following opposition leader Ariel Sharon's visit to Har HaBayit in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. 2001 to 2005, Hamas carries out 136 bombings, including suicide bombings in Israel, killing 599 people and injuring 766. 2004, March and April, Israeli airstrikes kill Hamas's co-founder and spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, and co-founder and political leader, Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi. 2005, August-September, Israeli forces start a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, which had been captured from Egypt in the 1967 Middle East War, abandoning settlements and leaving the densely populated enclave under the control of the Palestinian Authority. 2006, January, Hamas wins a majority of seats in a Palestinian legislative election. Israel and the United States cut off aid to Palestinians because Hamas refuses to renounce violence and recognize Israel. Gaza is now ruled by Hamas, whilst the West Bank falls under Palestinian Authority control, the PA, with Mahmoud Abbas as president. 2006, June the 25th. Hamas militants capture Israeli conscript Gilad Shalit in a cross-border raid, prompting Israeli airstrikes and incursions. Shalit is finally freed over 5 years later in a prisoner exchange, forcing Israel to a U-turn on its policy never to agree to a prisoner exchange. 2007, June 14. Hamas takes over Gaza in a brief civil war, ousting Fatah forces loyal to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who is based in the West Bank. This means that Hamas controls Gaza and Fatah controls the West Bank. 2008, December the 27th, Israel launches a 22-day military offensive in Gaza called Operation Cast Lead, or Feret Yitzukah, after Palestinians fire rockets at the southern Israeli town of Sderot. About 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis are reported killed before a ceasefire is agreed. 2012, November the 14th, Israel kills Hamas's military chief of staff, Ahmed Jabari, and 8 days of Palestinian militant rocket fire and Israeli Operation Pillar of Defense, Amud Anan, follow. 2014, July and August, the kidnapped and killing of 3 Israeli teenagers by Hamas leads to a 7-week war, Operation Protective Edge, Mivtza Tzuk Eitan, in which more than 2,100 Palestinians were reported killed in Gaza and 73 Israelis were reported killed, of which 67 were soldiers. 2018, March. Weekly Palestinian protests on Fridays begin at Gaza's border with Israel, and Israeli troops open fire to keep them back. More than 170 Palestinians reported killed in several months of protest, which also prompt fighting between Hamas and Israeli forces. The 4th general election takes place. Once again, there is no definitive result, and the coalition negotiations begin. 2021, May. Operation Guardian of the Walls, Magen Humot, occurred after clashes on the Temple Mount between Palestinian youth and Israeli police. After weeks of tension during the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, Israeli police clashed with Palestinian protesters near the Al-Aqsa Mosque. 2021, May the 10th. Hamas declares itself the defender of Al-Aqsa and demands Israel withdraw its security forces from the compound. Hamas fires a barrage of rockets from Gaza into Israel. Israel hits back with airstrikes on Gaza. Operation Guardian of the Walls is underway. May 11th. The death toll mounts as the aerial bombardments continue. A 13-story residential building in Gaza collapses after being hit during an Israeli airstrike. Israel maintains that Hamas was storing rockets in the building. Hamas denies this, and Palestinian militants launch rockets deep into Israel. Israel's protective Iron Dome comes into use, and very few rockets penetrate the defense system. May 12, the United States announces it will send an envoy to the region. Israel's military kills a senior Hamas commander in Gaza during more hostilities. May 13, Israeli airstrikes and militant rocket fire continue, and violence worsens in mixed communities of Jews and Arabs in Israel. Synagogues are attacked and clashes break out in some towns. May 14, Israel uses warplanes, tanks and artillery against a network of Palestinian militant tunnels under Gaza, in an operation that is followed by more Palestinian rocket salvos. May 17, Israeli missile attacks killed top Islamic Jihad commander Hussein Abu Harbid and hit a 7-story office building that the military said was used by Hamas. Rockets fired by the militants hit a synagogue in the Israeli town of Ashkelon and an apartment block in Ashdod. May 18, Israel says around 4,000 rockets have been launched into Israel from Gaza, but most have been intercepted by the missile defenses. May 19, the United Nations Humanitarian Agency says nearly 450 buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed or badly damaged. Around 52,000 people have fled their homes, with most sheltering in United Nations-run schools. May 20, both sides resume their attacks, but ceasefire talks intensify. Israeli authorities say 12 people have been killed so far in Israel, and it has killed around 160 militants. May 20, Hamas and the Israeli cabinet issue statements saying a truce has been agreed. With the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Abraham Accords, namely the peace agreements between Israel and several Arab states, and the Russian-Ukrainian war, the question of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, through the various groups such as Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, Hezbollah, and the growing shadow of Iran, peace remains unresolved.